Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a tunic worn by an artist that witnessed D-Day, a rifle that was recovered from the ruins of a shipwreck, as well as rogue leaflets from a drop on North Africa. Mark Piepau looks at World War II flyers dropped at the beginning of Operation Torch in 1942.
This is the squadron crest for 233 Squadron, which is an RAF squadron, which your father was attached to.
Kevin Robbins looks at an artist's tunic, a uniform worn by those commissioned to paint war scenes.
I think the big thing was him being the only war artist to land on Juno Beach. Just put that much more emphasis on how much he had to do to portray a first-hand experience.
Ken Chislett looks at a Winchester Navy rifle, recovered from the blown-up USS Maine.
You're in a damp climate, you're going to get venting problems. It built up methane, and it doesn't take much to set that off. My name is Bruce Ellis. I brought in a model 1895 Winchester Lee Navy rifle. It was in the arms locker of the USS Maine when it blew up, and it was recovered sometime after the explosion, and I got it at auction.
The Spanish-American War helped establish the US's vision of itself as a defender of democracy. In 1895, President William McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American interests as the Cubans fought for independence from Spain. A mysterious explosion destroyed the American battleship and killed most of its crew. The precise cause has never been proven, but it led to the US and Spain declaring war on each other. It was a lopsided 16-week conflict that spilled over into the Pacific. When Spain surrendered, it ceded ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands to the US. Cuba gained its independence, but the US was granted a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay.
Welcome, Bruce. Can you tell us what you brought in?
What I have is a relic from the USS Maine, which was an American battleship that was blown up, exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898. This fragment was dredged out of the harbor about 2 years later. The other piece we have is what it looked like before the explosion.
These are interesting firearms because they were designed for the U.S. Navy and a small caliber bullet, 236 or 6mm Lee, and it was designed to penetrate armor and shoot longer ways from ship to ship sort of action. And it used a cam type of pullback action. And it pulls back to that and cams upwards and loads the shells, and then you load forward and lock it in, and away you went. Bruce, what else can you tell us about the explosion?
Initially, in the press, it was a mine, that is the stationary explosive device under the water, a torpedo fired from another ship. There was some speculation that to provoke the U.S. into military action, that the Cuban insurreccionados, the rebels, planted a bomb in the magazine. That's extremely tenuous. And best forensic case is that, remember, it was a coal-powered ship. The grade of coal used was not the best. Also, you're in a damp climate, you're going to get venting problems, as you do in any ship or any boat. And it built up methane, and it doesn't take much to set that off. And that's most probably, given the violence of the explosion and the physical location of the explosion, what happened.
Yeah. In 1911, they got the funds to clear the harbor of the wreckage, and they put a cofferdam around the ship and drained it out and recovered remains of sailors that were left aboard. There was, I believe, 298 sailors perished in that explosion.
Yeah, that's about 2/3 of the crew.
2/3 of the crew, exactly. And I assume that's when this was recovered, when they did that, and a bunch of artifacts, and they floated the hull and sailed out to sea and sunk it. Of interest, the crow's nest and mast off that ship is in Arlington Cemetery. Bruce, what can you tell us about the cross here?
That's a grave marker for veterans of the Spanish-American War. And this just notes the various theaters.
What can you tell us about the Spanish-American War?
Well, initially, there was a series of small revolts in Cuba by Cubaneros objecting to Spanish rule. Now, most Americans could care less about what's going on in Cuba, but the newspapers, who were attracted to anything that bleeds,
Yes.
took it as, good press. And indeed, it was. The U.S. was just getting over the post-Civil War slump. In fact, a lot of the Civil War ironclads were still on coastal patrol, and they needed coal imports if they were going to become an effective naval power.
There was an interest in the United States to obtain certain possessions that Spain had from coaling stations in the Pacific and around the territorial Caribbean. So when it exploded in Havana Harbor, it was used as a catalyst to push towards war with Spain. And there was a familiar cry at the time, a rally, like Remember the Alamos, Remember the Maine. Bruce, most Canadians aren't very familiar with the Spanish-American War, but I understand there was a couple of Nova Scotians that went down and fought in that war, and you tell us about that.
Yeah, that would be the Mellor brothers from what we now call the Maitland area. I believe they were both on the USS Nebraska off Cuba. There was a requirement to cut some Spanish communication cables, and they went out in a small boat, both the boys, and did that while taking fire from the Spanish. And for that, they were both awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. This happens very infrequently in terms of brothers, and they both, as far as I can tell from the after-action report, really earned it.
Well, Bruce, the war never lasted that long, but it took place in a tropical climate. What was the effect of that on the health of the soldiers?
Oh, you lost far more through malaria, yellow fever, and certainly the climate, which most soldiers weren't climated to at that time. Food went bad real quick. Dysentery is a great leveler of any army.
Yes.
So your losses were perhaps 1/3 in combat, but 2/3 to health problems.
Well, Bruce, this is quite an amazing artifact here. You don't see something off the Maine every day. What do you plan to do with these items?
Well, you never see a U-Haul behind a hearse.
That's
so
true.
I hope that this will go to someone who appreciates it.
Mm-hmm.
At my age, you start to think about stuff like that.
Thank you again for bringing it in.
My pleasure. Doesn't matter if it's a musket or a sword or a World War I rum jug or grandfather's medals. They're all physical touchstones of an experience.
Coming up on Militaria.
His main role there was to get a first-hand experience of what the soldiers would have been experiencing there through sketches.
My name is Dustine Rodier.
My name's Brandon Rodier. I grew up in Vancouver and moved here a couple years ago.
We brought in my grandfather Orville Fisher's tunic.
As well as his pin for his D-Day landings.
My mom, actually, when she passed away, they were passed down to our son, Brandon.
Not everyone sent into action during the Second World War was armed with a gun. Some carried little more than a sketchbook. War artists explore sensory dimensions of conflict that are usually absent from the written histories of warfare. Canada commissioned 32 war artists during the Second World War, including the celebrated Nova Scotian painter Alex Colville. Canadian artists created 5,000 sketches and paintings during the war. They depicted scenes including frantic dogfights in the sky, naval maneuvers on storm-tossed seas, soldiers dying on devastated battlefields, and the nightmares of the Nazi concentration camps. Most of Canada's war art is on display at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa.
Well, good morning, Dustine, Brandon. It's awful nice to meet
Good
you.
morning.
Maybe you could give us a little intro into the uniform and the awards that you've brought in.
Thank you. So this is my grandfather Orville Fisher's tunic and his miniatures from the Second World War.
And for those who don't know who Orville Fisher was,
He was the only Allied war artist to land on D-Day.
indeed, the uniform itself is a standard sort of serge issue for a Canadian officer of the 3rd Division. Your grandfather enlisted as a sapper in the Engineers. His war is represented here with these ribbons, which when you saw these things, everybody could literally tell where people were. This is sort of like a barcode almost for someone's war. These are miniatures of the full-size medals that your grandfather had been awarded. This is a particularly interesting one, is the active service pin. These were issued to serving personnel in the Canadian Army before they were sent overseas. So that pin allowed anyone to know that he was doing his part. So you don't really see too many of the active service pins anymore. Brandon, I was wondering if, on behalf of your family, if you'd like to sort of share any of the recollections of your grandfather's experience going on to the beach.
Yeah, for sure. My great-grandfather landed with the 3rd Infantry Division on Juno Beach. His main role there, along with fighting up the beach, was to get a first-hand experience of what the soldiers would have been experiencing there through sketches, with only a 15 by 30 centimeter piece of waterproof paper on his forearm and a couple of charcoal pencils. Just put that much more emphasis on how much he had to do to portray a first-hand experience in what he can in that short amount of time.
Then again, starting to do sketches behind beach obstacles under fire, where every sort of part of your body would likely be screaming at you to take cover, or at least to shoot back. Your grandfather has his pad and his charcoals. He goes right to work. It's an extraordinary story within like this huge portrait of the Canadians coming in at Juno Beach. Your grandfather's famous painting of the landing on Juno Beach is this iconic aspect of D-Day in Canadian World War II history. D-Day is the long-awaited invasion of the continent of Europe from the West. This is the culmination of an enormous effort, an international effort, and Canada taking part in this. Their grandfather is witness to that, and on a daily basis records the hardship and the slaughter that is Normandy.
He wasn't very open in talking about what he'd gone through. Once in a while, he would share a story. For example, he went through 7 Jeep drivers throughout the course of being overseas. I think with everything that he went through, he came back with baggage. Looking back, I do believe that he was suffering, and we're doing so much better in society, learning about and accepting and being open about talking about, PTSD. Back then they had nothing. They came back from the war and that's it. Have a nice life. Makes me even more sad for, these men and women that have served and given up so much of their lives for so long. They come back and are expected to just slide right back into society with no support. So.
And you're right, again, like people would come back and it was like you just kind of put that away and the war will always be with them. Your grandfather taking all those sketches and turning them into like oil paintings, how the war stayed with him even longer because he was still immersed deep into the sort of subject matter that he'd done. When Canadians land with members of the 3rd Division, the Canadian 3rd Division goes toe-to-toe with the 12th SS. The combat is absolutely horrendous. What they'll endure, it's a long, ugly battle, the campaign for Normandy. I was wondering if you could share with us any sort of recollections of your grandfather, like what he was like as a person.
Absolutely. He was an incredibly creative person, very kind. He and I spent a lot of time together and we would talk. And I remember it was just he and I, and he was getting older by then, and he put his hand on my hand and he said, "Don't feel bad when I die. I don't want you to be sad." He said, "I've had a good life. I've done everything that I wanted to do, and I'm happy." My grandfather did go back for the 50th anniversary of Juno Beach, and that was the first time that he'd been back. At the end of it, I think he was relieved. I think it was helpful for him.
You see the effect that this man's experience had on his family. His example has reverbed through his family and down into generations. Embraced Canadian history, not for the romantics of militarism or the glories of war, but to show what ordinary people are capable of doing under extraordinary circumstances, because in knowing their stories are our stories. And through that, we can build a better country, better communities, and it gives a greater sense of meaning and respect to the sort of mantle that we have to carry. Now, we were talking a little earlier, too, about your grandfather's awards and his uniform. And of course, you know, we never asked to have it donated. But at the Army Museum, we have had an artist in residence program for a number of years. Keeping with that, we were wondering, perhaps on behalf of the museum, if you'd ever be interested in loaning your grandfather's uniform, where we could highlight his role and his sort of legacy to the memory of that Second World War generation.
We'd be happy to. That would be something that we would be pleased to take part in.
Well, it'd be a great honor. It's just been really an amazing thing to meet you and to have a contact with the captain's family. You always kind of see when you see his photograph what a nice man he was, and the gentle warrior from Canada.
To have his tunic and his medals displayed as part of an exhibit to support the war art program and people that have served and have come back and are using art as a way to potentially heal, we'd be proud to take part in that.
Coming up on Militaria.
This is signatures of squadron members at Gibraltar in 1942. My name is Jane McKay. I spent time as a kid all over the countryside traveling with my dad, who was military, and he was stationed different places. I brought in 2 original copies of flyers that were dropped in the first operation of Operation Torch, North Africa in 1942.
Gibraltar has been a strategic stronghold for the British since the 1700s. Jutting out from the southern tip of Spain, its 400-metre-tall limestone cliffs stare across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar to the African continent. During World War II, Gibraltar controlled virtually all naval traffic travelling between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. By mid-war, more than 30,000 British soldiers, sailors and airmen were stationed at Gibraltar. Within the limestone rock, they created an underground city, including more than 50 kilometers of tunnels and a fully equipped hospital. It was here at Gibraltar that the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the Allied invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch.
Well, I'd like to welcome Jan again to our segment here.
Thank you.
What we have here is I would say, a very historic item, and probably the only one of its time. This is the squadron crest for 233 Squadron, which was an RAF squadron, which your father was attached to.
Mm-hmm. His name was Everett Badu. He was always known as Shan through his Air Force career. Other people mostly didn't even know his name was Everett.
These are individual signatures of everyone on the squadron?
This is signatures of squadron members at Gibraltar in 1942.
And the Latin "strong and faithful" is the motto of the squadron.
General Eisenhower was on Gibraltar. He was commanding the invasion of North Africa, which Operation Torch was the beginning of.
233 Squadron was tasked with a leaflet dropping operation.
He had these that are part of the original thing. They're not copies, because when he landed back at Gibraltar, a couple of them had stuck to the side of the fuselage, and he retrieved them.
So they weren't deployed fully.
Yes, he missed 2. My father was the squadron leader, and they were tasked with flying over 3 cities, towns in North Africa on the early mornings for 6 o'clock in the morning of Operation Torch, which was November 1942. And it was to let the civilians know primarily that they weren't going to be attacking civilians, but there was going to be a landing of troops on an invasion of North Africa. The Vichy French primarily were who was there. And so from Gibraltar, they flew in to coordinate with the attack in the morning.
These are very high quality made leaflets that were dropped.
He thinks they were printed in the States, and I looked at them once and thought, well, this is also about the Americans, you know, but there's British and Canadians, and British were a large part of that force, and I thought, you know, this is a little one-sided, but it was purposeful. The relationship between the French and the British was quite tense, so they were highlighting the Americans' involvement because there was a better relationship between the French and the Americans.
Operation Torch, which Chambadou was involved in was the first American-led operation that was the Free French territories as well. And the Free French had amassed the remembrance of the French Navy at Oran, and that was part of that force that the Americans and the Allies were particularly concerned about. It was also a stepping stone that led to the Italian invasion of Sicily and ultimately the Italian mainland, which was a major contributor to the end of the Mediterranean War. The Gibraltar part of your father's operational career was just a small part of a very varied and interesting military career.
Always wanted to fly. His dad took him to Pictou Harbor one time when he was a young child and saw the American flying boats who were coming around on a tour to show off their airplanes, and he decided that's what he was going to do.
He started when he was 17 years old in Trenton, Nova Scotia.
So he did his private pilot's license. I think a little unusual in those days, but he always wanted to fly from when he was a kid. That's what he said anyway. Well, he was accepted into our CAF in 1938, but there was a year-long queue, right, to get into training and things, because I think people were, thinking that things were on the horizon. But the British had a program that they were accepting people from the Commonwealth to go into pilot training in the UK. So he wound up going to Scotland and training in the RAF there. I think he went overseas in early 39 or 38, before war had been declared anyway, and started training as a pilot there. He transferred back to the Canadian Air Force after the war. He did test work on the CF-100, first person to fly a jet in Canada. So he had a fairly long, interesting military career, and retired as a commanding officer at Greenwood in 1968.
So 223 ended up in Gibraltar.
Largely their responsibility was to keep communication and supplies going to Malta, but it was the only other piece of territory in all of Europe, North Africa, whatever, controlled by the Allies. Dad said there were more ships and people lost in those convoys to Malta than there were in the North Atlantic ones from Halifax. They weren't talking about it a lot because it was quite depressing. Statistically, his survival in the war for the number of hours he flew and how many people were lost and whatever, I think he was a little unusual. I think an illustration of how dangerous could be. I mean, you're flying leaflets over this place, and does that seem really dangerous? But they were at 1,000 feet, right? Otherwise, the leaflets were going to be like gone halfway across the Atlantic or something likely, right? And they're anti-aircraft guns, but 5 aircraft on this expedition went out, and only 3 came back. A lot were lost.
So Jane, we've got these great items here. The long-term, I guess, preservation of these artifacts and the story they tell is something that my particular museum does, telling the story of a Nova Scotia boy that went out and did some pretty incredible things and had a pretty incredible career. Would you be open to loaning items?
I think the short answer is yes. It needs to go somewhere where people preserve it and understand it.
The story of Chambadou is one that most people probably don't know. And Jane, in a sense, she's carrying that last torch of that remembrance.
Keeping all of this stuff in the story going, whatever is difficult, I think it should go on somewhere where we can keep telling these stories. We need to learn and understand things from the past. So it'd be better in a more public venue. And we have the book that my dad wrote, The Wedge in the Door, about his time in Gibraltar.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, for bringing these particular items.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. The stories get lost if we don't tell them.